button. So, thank you for being here today, those who are. Going to continue on with our discussion of David, looking at the life of David. As we continue on, we're going to transition to his time when he was actually king. We talked last couple classes about the early years of David's life, how he was chosen the youngest of all the brothers, obviously the very unexpected candidate of all his brothers to actually come and be anointed as king. Though, of course, did he immediately step into being a king after he was anointed? No, he did not. So he was anointed at a very young age, and it took many years before he actually became king, because the king at the time obviously was still alive and still on the throne, and that king was who? Saul, right? King Saul. Saul was the first king of Israel at this point. Again, I think it needs to be emphasized that when the people were clamoring for a king, they wanted a king like the nations. And God kind of gave them a king like the nations, somebody who was tall and good looking and seemed to have all the physical traits he needed to be an effective king. But it showed quite clearly in his actual kingship that he was not really worthy to lead God's people. Maybe he would have been fine to lead like the nations and other nations, but he was not fit to lead God's people. And God kind of forsook him because of that. But as the years rolled on, David continued to grow up, mature. We talked obviously about how David claimed a great victory by defeating Goliath, defeating the Philistines in a battle, being very important there. He did what Saul was really supposed to do. As we again said, Saul's supposed to be, he's head taller than everyone else. He's supposed to be the leader of the people of Israel. He was supposed to be the one to fight Goliath. He does not do his kingly duty, though, and passes it on to our young David at this point, who defeats Goliath with a sling and a stone, and then proceeds to then chase the Philistines off the battlefield after he decapitates Goliath with Goliath's own sword at this point. Very interesting. So as he continues on throughout this time, he comes into the service of Saul. The years go by. He eventually asks to marry Saul's daughter, Michal, because Saul was trying to give him one of his other daughters, but David had a particular eye for Michal, and Michal also really fancied David. By the way, we're going to get into this a little bit this week, but Michal was actually supposed to be promised to someone else. But Michal wanted David, and David wanted Michal, and so Saul was like, okay, fine, if you give me 100 Philistine foreskins, I was going to say it, then you can have my daughter's hand in marriage. David said, forget 100, I'm going to bring you 200. And again, this seems like a very strange trophy of battle, but again, we remember what was the distinctive physical difference between Jews and non-Jews was circumcision, right? So it was kind of a symbol of defeating an enemy, because obviously you did not defeat friendly forces if you were able to take a foreskin, because the people of Israel did not have them. So this was clearly a showing of being able to defeat the enemy, which obviously he did by doing this. He was able to win Michal's hand at this point. And as he wins all these victories, the people praise him. They say, David, yes, Saul has killed his hundreds, but David has killed his thousands. David is so awesome. David is so mighty. And because of this, Saul gets very jealous. Saul attempts to kill David. It's actually Saul's own son, Jonathan, who saves David from being murdered. He says, hey, you need to run, and I will give you a sign that says that whether you need to run or not. He gave him the sign, and so David fled. He was a exile for a long time from the people. At this time, he gathered a group of ragtag warriors that would later be called David's mighty men, who were very skilled in battle and defeating enemies. And this became kind of his fighting force. He worked as a mercenary for a little while, and he had multiple opportunities during this time period to kill Saul. And of course, if he killed Saul, who would then be king? Well, potentially if he just killed Saul, right? But who should have been king if he had killed Saul? It should have been David, really, right? Because he was the one who was anointed. So could he have killed Saul and said, I was anointed by Samuel to be king, and could he have then got his way to be king? Yes. But David continued to not kill Saul on multiple occasions when he had the opportunity. And the thing that David said over and over again is, I will not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. And this was a very big thing for David, because not only one was this respect to God, because God had initially chosen Saul to be king. So he was showing reverence to God, but also, pragmatically, he did not want to set a precedent for the Lord's anointed being killed, because what was David? Also the Lord's anointed, right? So he doesn't want to kill the Lord's anointed. He doesn't want the Lord's anointed to be killed violently, because guess who he is? The Lord's anointed. It's going to happen to him. It's going to happen to him, right? It's live by the sword, die by the sword, that old idiom, right? And I think that fits in this case. He didn't want to suffer maybe a similar fate that he would be giving to Saul at this point. So he stays his hand. Eventually, does Saul die? Well, yes, all people die. But yes, Saul does die. Do you remember how he died? Anybody who was here last week?
In battle?
In battle. Against who?
The
Philistines, common foe, right? He is defeated by the Philistines. By the way, who also dies alongside him? Jonathan, his son, right? His son Jonathan at this point as well, right? So the throne is kind of left wide open at this point. David could have maybe claimed the throne of Israel, but that is not what happened. One of Saul's sons, Ishbosheth, great name if anybody's looking for baby names, Ishbosheth, takes over the throne of Israel, while David becomes the king where? In Judah, right? Okay. So at this point, we kind of see the promised land of God, the land of Canaan, where the Israelites are supposed to live, has kind of been divided at this point a little bit. There is one king in Israel and one king in Judah. This is going to foreshadow future events when the kingdom gets split later. And we'll get into that after David and Solomon, because the kingdom will not be split again until the time after Solomon. But eventually, Ishbosheth is murdered, and as he is murdered, David becomes king of all of Israel, and his original capital was not Jerusalem, but David's original capital was Hebron, 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 there in Judah. So, and he later ends up taking over Jerusalem. But we need to talk about David, as he is described in the scriptures as a man after God's own heart. At this point, he is king. We've seen this backstory. We've seen all these things that have happened to him. He now becomes king. And I want to discuss what it meant for David to be a man after God's own heart, because he is called specifically in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. I'm too far from it here. Hold on. He is called a man after God's own heart. I will pull that up right now and read it for you real quick. Okay. So verse 14 of chapter 13, 1 Samuel. But now your kingdom shall not endure. Yahweh has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and Yahweh has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what Yahweh has commanded you. So we see this is from the prophet Samuel talking to Saul, not talking to David, talking to Saul, and says, God is seeking a man to become the king of Israel, who is a man after God's own heart. And of course, we know who that is going to end up being. It's going to be David at this point. So he is called a man after God's own heart, which is quite a thing for somebody to be called, because we of course, we know the heart of God is all loving, all pure, all holy. So for someone to have to be a man after God's own heart is quite a big statement to make. And some of David's life shows this, how he can be called a man after God's own heart. And we're going to talk about some of the good things he did. So when you read the book of Psalms, by the way, it says 150 Psalms. I believe there's actually 151 Psalms. No, there's 150 Psalms. Anyway, he writes almost half of all the Psalms there are in the Psalms. the book Psalms was not obviously written by one person. It was a collection of songs. Think about our songbook, right? Our songbooks that we've got. I know we don't really use songbooks anymore, but if we had a songbook, like we do sometimes underneath the chairs in the auditorium, we've got a collection of songs, a cornucopia of songs from different people from different times who are writing. And it's the same way with Psalms. However, almost half of the Psalms are written by David. And so he becomes the most prolific writer of the Psalms. And of course, some of the most beautiful praises and descriptions of God's glory and majesty come from the Psalms. And it's hard to read the Psalms and not think of somebody who is absolutely infatuated, in love, enthralled by the idea of God. And if you think about David's lifestyle, it's easy to see maybe why he wrote so many psalms, and why he praised God in such a way he did. Because what, again, was David's profession growing up?
A shepherd.
He was a shepherd, right? So when you are a shepherd, are you spending much time indoors? Not really, right?
You have time.
Yes, you got a lot of time on your hands outdoors, right? You're taking sheep from pasture land to pasture land to pasture land to pasture land, right? So there's a lot of time you're spending outside with other people? No, sheep, right? Anybody to talk to? Sheep, right? Sheep and God, right? That's pretty much it, right? And so this is what he ends up doing. He spends all this time in prayer. He spends all this time in kind of meditating thought towards God in this way. And so why is he able to write so many of these psalms? Well, he sits in a field with a musical instrument, probably with a lyre, and he is able to then play play chords and think about his God, and he creates these songs that end up becoming the Psalms. And by the way, all of these psalms are not written when he is a little boy David in the pastures. A lot of these psalms are also written at other times as well in his life. Most notably, one of the biggest times whenever he writes a lot of the psalms is when he is on the run for his life from who? From Saul. Saul's actively trying to kill him. Saul's assassins are forever at David's heels, and David's constantly on the run. And that's why we see a lot of the Psalms of David talking about, save me from my enemies, preserve me from those who are trying to take my life. I'm in dark times. I'm supposed to be the anointed king of Israel, but instead I'm in exile in foreign lands, living a militaristic, mercenary lifestyle. Go ahead.
He couldn't have had pen and paper. I mean, how did he record it back then?
Well, that's kind of an interesting thing, right? So you would think that most likely what happened is that he would have written these songs, known these songs, sang these, well, maybe not written them, but he would have sang these songs, known them, and then whenever he became king later, he would recite them, and then he would have a scribe write them down, and then they end up being kept, and then later collected into this. But yeah, I think most of his psalms would have just come straight from the mind, right, at this point?
Mason will make up a song,
Yeah.
like once, but he remembers what he created.
Really?
That he created.
If you're creating it, you kind of remember it.
Yeah.
I guess. I don't know. I'm not like
Those
that.
are some long ones.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's certain people that just have more knacks in that way, right?
And if you set all that time to practice that,
Yeah.
doing that,
Mhm.
like, well,
Yeah.
he's got a lot of free time. Well,
Yeah.
not free time. Obviously, he's working, but
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
it's a lot calmer probably than what other people are doing.
Well, correct. Well, I mean, think about, for example, how much time maybe we spend scrolling on a phone every day. If you dedicated that much time, or just on electrical devices in general or something like that, if you took all that time and dedicated it to playing instruments, singing songs and hymns, imagine how much you might remember. And by the way, there's a lot of studies that have been done that shows that our memories have become less, we have less ability to memorize things in our modern day because we kind of short circuit our brain full of all the dopamine and everything else we're getting on our phones at all times. And do we feel like we have to remember most things? No, because we have phones to remind us, we have alarms, we've got all these different things to help us do this in this way. Do they have that during this day and age? They do not. right? So literally their brain plasticity is very different than what ours is today. So them remembering things would be very different than it is for us in our modern day. And so because of that, I think that he's able to remember these things probably easier than we would ever think to be able to do on our own, right? And yes, and so I think this is why we're able to capture all these things. And by the way, do we probably have every song of David recorded to us? Probably not, right? There probably was hundreds of other songs that he created and sang or whatever that just didn't get put into the Psalms, but yet we have so many still. We got the important ones, right? Clearly, the ones that God wanted us to have at this point. There's probably a lot of others that he did that maybe weren't as good. So, or at least God didn't deem to be worthy of keeping in the Psalms. So, but again, so we have these different types of psalms that David put together. But again, when we're talking about a man after God's own heart, I think we see this in the Psalms. How many of us have written an entire song of praise to God?
I have.
Right? You have. You've been the only one probably in this room because I haven't, and the others haven't. But I think this is not something that everyone does. But not only just write one, but to write this many, and to the depths of praise that he is giving to God at this point. And so again, we're seeing the good things as to why he would have been called a man after God's own heart. The other thing that we see throughout David's life is he is a person who acts as prophet, priest, and king, which is very interesting because Saul, at certain times, kind of tried to do this, and he was really called out for it a lot of times, right? But I think part of this is also the fact that he was not doing it with the right heart. And I think whenever we talk about, we remember one of the strikes against Saul specifically was when he did something wrong. He did one thing wrong in particular. What was it?
It's an offering.
An offering, right? He did an offering that he was not supposed to do. He was supposed to wait. He was supposed to allow Samuel to do the offering. And this was one of the strikes against him by God. David offers sacrifices, which is interesting. Why is it that David was able to offer sacrifices, but yet Saul wasn't? Well, again, I think it comes back to what was the heart. Why did Saul offer that sacrifice?
So he could for his own like desire or gain or whatever.
Okay, so I'm going to combine these thoughts together. So for the people, because the people were scattering, saying, "We're just sitting here. I need to go home." He was doing it for himself because he thought, if the people leave, I'm not going to be able to win this battle. So I need to do what I'm not supposed to do in order to gain favor by man, because I don't trust that God's going to deliver me the victory regardless. David does not do these things with this intention. He does these things with the heart of true, or really the time when he offers sacrifices is usually after he or the people have fallen. Right? And he is acting in their stead as an intermediary, or he himself is offering sacrifices to God because of his own sins in this way. So he is not doing this with a selfish heart or an untrusting heart that he does not trust God. Kind of in a way, yes. Yeah, because that's when we really see this happening in this way. But we also see him act in prophecy because if you read the Psalms, there are prophetic words within them. Most notably, of course, I think Psalm 22 would be really maybe our biggest example because, of course, this is the psalm that ends up predicting much of Jesus' life, especially, most importantly, his death on the cross. And we see that shown in chapter 22 of Psalms. But more than that, there is continual prophetic language within the Psalms. And, of course, we know he acted as king. He sets a precedent for the best leaders to be able to act in this way, but really, no one was able to really do this as well as David until who?
Jesus.
Solomon?
Jesus would really be it. No, Solomon fails pretty terrifically in a lot of these ways, right? Yeah. And we'll get into that a little bit more as the time goes along. But really, he sets the template that only Jesus is going to be able to follow at that point, right? Because did Jesus prophesy? Oh yeah, absolutely. He prophesied throughout his entire time that he was here on earth. Did he? Is he our great high priest? Hebrews tells us he is our great high priest. And of course, is Jesus Lord?
Yeah.
He is. So he is king. Jesus acts as the ultimate prophet, priest, and king in this way. And really, the only people who were able to do this throughout the history of the Bible, the only other person was David.
Jesus even quotes David when they're asking, trying to trick him.
Yes.
He quotes Psalms 110,
Mm-hmm.
I think, in regards to say, who is Lord?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, when we talk about a man after God's own heart, why is David called this? Well, we talked about some of the things that showed in his character, but also he's the only mortal man who is not God in the flesh, who is able to act as a prophet, priest, and king. And again, I wanted to show some examples. Prophesying in the Psalms, offering sacrifice, especially 2 Samuel 24, he does this, and reigning as king over all of Israel. He's the only one who is able to kind of successfully do this.
What was the context of him offering those sacrifices? Was it in front of people, or was it just in front of the men that he had at that time?
This particular sacrifice was whenever he was offering it in front of the people, but it was because of the illegal census that he took.
Oh.
That then he had to offer sacrifices for the people because there was a disease
Right.
that went amongst the people, and he offered the sacrifice for doing that. That's the specific example there. I think he did another time as well, but I didn't exactly have that one down. But yes, so that specific example was for that. But again, acting as priest for the people, which is very interesting because when someone has fallen, you would expect the priest to do this, but he steps in and acts this way. Which again, I think that just shows how he has a heart after God in this way. And of course, the next point leads us into what I'd already just mentioned. Of whose line does Jesus come from? There is 12 tribes of Israel. It is from the line of who that Jesus comes.
David.
The tribe of Judah specifically, with which David was of. David was of the tribe of Judah. Jesus comes from not just the tribe of Judah, but the line of David at this point. So when the Messiah was going to come, God made flesh, he comes from the line of David. So again, when we're seeing how is David called a man after God's own heart, we're seeing a lot of these examples of why he was called a man after God's own heart. Now, does that mean he was always acting as a man after God's own heart? No. And I want to get into those things as well, because that's the thing. We see him called a man after God's own heart, but yet some of his life is not acting as a man after God's own heart, and is in fact some of the worst things that a person could do, what he ends up doing in his life. So one thing we kind of see as a theme early from the scriptures on about talking about David, he's got a thing for other men's wives. We talked about this earlier. Michal was already betrothed to another. Saul was trying to give David the hand of one of his other daughters, but David says, no, I want Michal. I want that one. So there's one example of him trying to take someone else's betrothed wife. Time goes along. One of his other wives, I think I've got it here, Abigail, had offended David at one point. Not Abigail, but her husband. David almost kills him. Instead, Abigail steps in, offers him some supplies or something like that because Abigail's husband had deceived him. Abigail's husband dies, not by David's hand. But then what immediately happens? Who goes and marries her? David does. By the way. Huh?
She's a widow.
She's a widow technically at this point, right? But did he clearly have some desire for her probably beforehand to go, oh man, her husband died? Let's go. I'm going to get her real quick, right? There's something to this fact, obviously, right? Some nefariousness here. Then, of course, Bathsheba. And that's a whole thing we're going to get into, of course, as time goes along. Bathsheba is, of course, the most famous example of him desiring married women, at least the women who are supposed to be of another man, right?
Did he have multiple wives at the same time?
Yes. Correct. Which, by the way, another downfalling. If you want to talk about downfallings, that's another downfalling. Because he has a dispute with Michal, his first wife. They never actually have children. He ends up marrying Abigail. They have some children. He marries, obviously, Bathsheba. They have one child that lives, one child who does not. And he has some other wives as well, some other concubines, which we hear about because when one of his sons ends up trying to take the throne from him later, he shames David by having relations with David's concubines on top of the roof for all of Israel to see. And so again, we see it's very animalistic and terribleness that happens. But again, you can't shame your father by laying with his concubines if you don't have concubines, right? So he's got multiple wives, multiple concubines. So again, we're seeing some of the faults clearly with David's life as well. Another thing, he is later called a man of much blood. He is called a man of much blood. This is in 1 Chronicles 22, verse 8. He is called a man of much blood. And we kind of see this throughout his life. How many people did David kill? Whenever the crowds are chanting, Saul has killed his hundreds, while David has killed his thousands. He's got a lot of blood on his hands. We know he killed 200 men just to marry a woman. How many other people did he kill throughout his life? Huh? Yeah, that's right. He did everything to the highest limits, right? Apparently, so yes. And so he is described later as a man of much blood, and most of that being blood of the enemy, but other times not so much, right? And so we see this part of him, and in fact, it is for this reason, being called a man of much blood, that God did not want him to build his temple. God says, I don't want my clean, pristine temple to me to be built by a man who has so much blood on his hands. In fact, I'm gonna read this account real quickly. Chronicles is after Kings. I know that. Go to the Kings and go to Chronicles. 1 Chronicles, chapter 22, verse 8. Let me read it here. I'm going to start in verse 6. Then he called for his son Solomon and commanded him to build a house for Yahweh, the God of Israel. And David said to Solomon, my son, I had it within my heart to build a house to the name of Yahweh my God. But the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, you have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house for my name, because you have shed so much blood on the earth before me. Interesting, right?
But that killed David.
Oh, you know it did.
You know it did.
He's worked his entire life. He's done all these things seemingly for the Lord. He's written so many psalms of praise. He said, and here's the thing. Who gathered all the materials for the temple? David. Who wrote all the plans out for the temple? David. Who captured the city and made it his capital for the temple to be put in? David. What is Jerusalem called? The city of God or the city of David? City of David. It's called the city of David. He does all these things to build this temple. And when the time comes to build it, God says, no. You have spilt too much blood. I don't want your name attached to the name of my temple. Yeah, that's a big statement. You know that killed him. How could it not have? Right? I think that's understandable. But again, when we see the acts of his life, we can maybe understand that a little bit. And of course, we have the worst of the worst, the thing that he did more than anything else, which was David's worst wrongdoing, was staying home during war, laying with a woman married to one of his most loyal warriors, Uriah the Hittite, and then having him murdered, Uriah the Hittite, when he could not justify Uriah or hide his indiscretion at this point, right? Because the whole event that happened, and again, this is something that gets talked about a lot, and I want to emphasize it again. David is supposed to be at the battlefield, right? He's supposed to be king. Remember, again, we get to the beginning of David's story. One of David's most famous things he did was he ends up stepping up and killing Goliath when who doesn't? Saul. Saul was supposed to go out of his tent. Saul was supposed to fight Goliath. Does Saul do it? No. David, his men are at war. Where should he be? With his men. He should be leading his men. He should be at the battlefield. Is that where he's at? No. He's standing on top of his palace, looking out, and he sees a woman bathing. And she's so beautiful that he says, I must have her. So he has her brought to him. He lays with her.
You got good eyesight.
He got good eyesight, apparently, right? apparently so.
I always thought about that.
Yeah.
Why do you see somebody like that?
That's a great question.
What if they had any kind of magnification?
Magnification device?
They're pretty smart back
I don't
then.
know. That'd be hard. I feel
But
like
then
that'd be hard
that's
to that
make it
day.
even worse.
That does make it even worse.
That makes it even
That does make it even
He
worse.
did, he did wrong.
Yes. But he sees her bathing. He has her brought to him. By the way, lays with her, and we don't really talk about this that much. Was she a willing participant in this? And even if she was a willing participant in the fact that he says, lay with me, and she does it, is there not a power dynamic problem here?
Yeah, he's king.
He's a king. What's she going to do, say no?
Uh-huh.
That's why some people have titled this the rape of Bathsheba.
Oh,
Isn't there a
interesting.
painting? Isn't there a painting
Of,
about that? I think it was called the rape of Bathsheba.
I know, potentially so. Potentially shown this way. But I think there's something to be said about this fact. I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I think there's something to the idea that I don't know the consensuality of this. Even if she said yes, there's a power dynamic here that is questionable, to say the least. Lays with her. She becomes pregnant. She's with child. She sends word to him that she is with child. David tries to cover up his indiscretion by having Uriah the Hittite brought from the front lines, tries to encourage him to go home to sleep with his wife. But Uriah says, my men are out on the battlefield. I can't sleep with my wife at home in the comforts of my home, knowing that they are out there fighting, which, by the way, that should have been a big old kick to David. Be like, yeah, he knows. What's wrong with you? and David even tries to get him drunk at this point to free his inhibitions. But Uriah the Hittite, even in his drunken state, passes out on the doorstep of his house and does not enter in to be with his wife. And so David says, well, the only way I'm going to be able to cover up this indiscretion is by doing what?
Kill him.
By having him killed. He says, put him on the front lines. When the enemy charges, blow a command, everyone else step back, Uriah's going to be out by himself on the battlefield. Murders. One of the people, by the way, Uriah the Hittite was one of David's mighty men. How long has Uriah been with David? Since he was on the run from Saul. Since before he was king of Judah, before he was king of Israel, before he was king in Jerusalem, before he had done any of these things. Uriah had been with David since David was nothing but a mercenary leader out in the desert.
So they're probably buddies.
They're very good buddies. And yet what does David do? Sleeps with his wife and has him killed. We'll talk more next week about kind of the depths of depravity that this really is. But when we talk about David, when he's at the highest of his highs, there's nobody much better. When he's at the lowest of the lows, there's not somebody much worse. And we see that in this story. And we'll talk more about it next week. Hate to close it on that kind of note, but our time for class has ended. So I'm going to say a word of prayer, and then I'll let you guys have your day. Heavenly Father, we thank you and praise you. We give you all glory and honor. We thank you for your word, which leads us and guides us. We thank you for the examples that you lay before us. Those who have risen high and those who have gone low, Father, that you can still use them for your perfect will. Help this to be an example for us, Father, to know that regardless of how we have messed up in the past, we can still serve you, Father. That we can still give you our all. That we can still give you all praise and glory and honor. Serve your good and perfect work. We pray that you help us during this time as we go into this time of worship. That, Father, whatever has happened this week, or whatever we have coming up in the week to come, Father, we can give ourselves fully to you in worship. We can give ourselves fully to you to glorify your name and to fulfill our purpose of our creation, which is to glorify and worship you. Pray that you help us in this time and always, Father. For your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
So you're saying that King Henry was much better than King David, right? Isn't that what you're saying?
No, I'm not at all.
Oh, come on, man. I mean, just think about the very few differences between the two.
Yes, the problem is though, is that King Henry did not have the high highs like David had. He definitely had the low lows like
But he
David
defended
had.
the Pope, man.
Yeah, like that.